Hi, and welcome to the use of storytelling to advance education reform. I'm really excited to have you here. My name is Megan Sweet, and I am a career educator here in California, in the United States. And I've done a lot of research on the use of storytelling. So let's get into it. So, why do we do storytelling? Sorry, I'm going to move these controls out of the way because they seem to be a problem. So, one moment. Okay, that should do it. Okay, so why storytelling? Why is such an important part of how we might want to advance education reform? That's kind of the point of this conversation. So let's just get right into it. There's basically three reasons why I think that use of storytelling is really important in educational settings. The first one is that schools are complex places. So while research and other kinds of information that we can gather or summarize about schools can be helpful and useful, it misses the nuances of what happens in schools that can be really important and transcendent in what makes the biggest difference around the programs that we provide to students and families. So research helpful, nothing wrong with it, but I think it should be rounded out with stories that help us to understand the nuances that the research is telling us. The research also tends to keep us focused on gaps and problems and can promote a deficit-minded approach towards education reform and the students that we serve. So we should use research sparingly, especially since research often represents points of view that might be negatively impacting one community or another one. And finally, stories give us that real world example that connects to our hearts and our minds and actually motivates us to change and to act in a way that research and other generalized information does not. So stories can be helpful if we want to catalyze action towards a certain direction. So let's see how that works. All right. So, oops, sorry. So let's do an example of student access to technology. This is a longstanding problem all around the world, certainly in the United States. Students who have less money, less access to opportunity often have reduced access to technology, things like computers, internet, things like that you really need. That's been a problem for a long time in education. Before the pandemic, schools were able to work with that in some way, either by not giving homework that required access to technology at home, or loaning computers to students, or doing computer-based work in school, things like that. But when we went to the pandemic and suddenly everybody was learning from home, having access to the internet, high quality, high speed internet, and to a computer became a fundamental necessity for every single student in the United States anyway, so that they could continue to learn. But the students and families that didn't have access to computers and technology, then it became a real problem for them to be able to access their learning when we were all in shelter in place. So here's some data that tells that same story. This is a RAND Corporation survey of teachers. They asked teachers what their experience was of students and technology. And they said that 20% of the teachers that they surveyed said that the students had challenges with technology, including lack of access to internet devices, things like that, so that they had problems themselves using technology to teach students during the pandemic. 78% of them says that their district provided devices, but only 45% said that they've supplied students with hotspots. So while a lot of the vast majority of our schools gave students technology and devices to have at home to do schoolwork, they didn't give them Wi-Fi hotspots that would have allowed them to check onto the internet. So that's an important point. And only 30% of teachers who work in the schools where we have the highest amount of students that qualify for free and reduced price lunch, which is our way of measuring students that are low income, reported that nearly all of their students had at-home internet access. That's compared to 83% of teachers who work in higher income schools. So again, that access to technology is important. And these are some facts and figures that were really important for us as we entered into the pandemic. Now here's a picture. This picture was taken by a mother in California, and those are her two daughters sitting there on the ground. And because they didn't have Wi-Fi access at home, her daughters were having to sit outside of a Taco Bell restaurant and use their internet access so that they could participate in school events. And the mother tweeted this picture, put this picture out on social media, sharing the challenges she was having supporting her daughters to have access to school during the pandemic. Now, think for yourself, just for a moment, which one of those stories impacted you more? So we looked at some facts and figures that rounded out, that gave us some really clear information around access to technology. And then we saw a picture of two students that were struggling with access to technology. So just for yourself, same issue, two different ways of going about it. Which one impacted you more? So just take a moment to think about that. I'm guessing for most of you, it was the picture. And if that's true, you're with almost everyone else. This picture in California went viral. And it was the topic of a lot of different news stories. And this picture actually catalyzed a lot of action. So there are news stories about it, as I said. One of them was called "The Photo of Girls Using Taco Bell Wi-Fi Becomes a Symbol of the Digital Divide." Another news story from USA Today, so a national newspaper. More than $130,000 were raised for the California family. So because a mother posted this picture, people started sending in money to help the girls get access to the internet. Again, when your hearts and your minds are connected, it catalyzes action in a way that just appealing to our brains alone does not. Here's another newspaper article from CNN, again, national news. School sends California family hotspot. Here's another news story, and here's an important one. Girls who use Wi-Fi at Taco Bell for school inspire new California legislation. So this picture, this story became something that actually changed the way we do laws here in California. We created a new law to address this issue, all from this one picture. The data that we saw was helpful, and you could use the data to give some support or some meaning to this picture, but the data alone didn't inspire any of this action. It was a picture of these two girls living with the impact of having lack of access to technology. So this is an example of how stories can be really powerful for us as we're thinking about school reform. The reason why this is true is because storytelling supports a communal approach to problem solving versus a hierarchical one. These are two graphs that came from Parker Palmer's work, A Courage to Teach, which basically means that if we imagine the data as that top-down response, there's an object, there's an expert, and they're telling us what to do. The data told us very clearly what the challenge was. And it could have been that some of that data would then be followed up with some recommendations about what we're supposed to do. And that's helpful and fine, but it doesn't acknowledge that there's lots of different ways to share about and experience that knowledge, that data. So that's why I think a communal approach is more impactful for us as we start to think about school change and why storytelling is so important. Because not only was the RAND Corporation, one of those knowers, pointing in at the subject, the need for us to address the digital divide, but so too then was the mother who took a picture of her daughters and her daughters herself and their experience, the digital divide. And when you have all those people working together and thinking together, then you can come up with much more innovative and powerful solutions. Normally, I do self-care breaks with folks and I do lessons together. So before I get into the next section, why don't we go ahead and do a quick self-care break? This is just a way for us to kind of refresh our brains before we move on to the next topic. It's about gratitude. So as you go throughout your day today, think of somebody who you're appreciative of. And my invitation would be to say thank you. So I apologize. We do these self-care breaks all the time because this is a quick 15-minute session. This one's just kind of surprising you. But gratitude, please be grateful today. Okay, story number 2. Stories help us to build connections. I've already been referencing this a little bit, that stories actually touch in on these major sensory sections in our body. So when we tell stories, it's not just that our brains are activated, our cognitive minds are activated, but we're able to have an emotional connection because we're able to see ourselves in someone else and we're able to see ourselves in ourselves. So storytelling helps us to build those emotional connections. And often then that causes us to, it impacts our volitional thinking or our guts and makes us want to move and act Again, think about the example of the two young girls outside of the Taco Bell restaurant. That picture and those facts that went with it brought action all the way up to changing state law in California. So pretty impactful. This is a quote from a researcher. He says, in telling, listening, and reading stories, the opportunity arises to share experiences about our own lives and the lives of others. So again, it builds those connections within ourselves, head, heart, and guts, but also between ourselves and other people, because suddenly we can start to see those connections and the barriers break down. Here's a reason why this is important. This is a quote from Valerie Kaur, who wrote See No Stranger. It's a really powerful book around how we might want to work together to create change in any parts of our worlds. We can think about in education settings. But specifically, draw your attention to this middle part of her quote, which says, who we wonder about determines whose stories we hear and whose joy and pain we share. Those we grieve with are ultimately those we organize with and advocate for. So if we want to get people catalyzed and working together towards creating impactful change in our education settings, we need to help people to understand and relate with the students and families and situations that we're experiencing in our schools so that they see themselves in our pain and our struggle and want to work with us and partner with us together. So let's do a quick activity that helps you maybe to think about that, helping us to connect in with our own pain of that disorientation or dislocation. So without thinking too much about it, I invite you to do a quick journal free write. People expect me to be blank, but I'm actually blank. So I'll give you about 30 seconds to fill that out. Okay. Thinking about that, and again, if we're building connections to others, and we won't be able to talk about it today, but as you think about just what people expect you to be, but when you actually are something else, how does it feel to be perceived or seen differently than you actually are? And what does that do for your willingness to break down your own personal barriers to work with someone else? What do you think those expectations are based on? And how do those lead to either positive or perhaps negative treatment based on what people expect you to be, based on what they see or think they know about you? And what do you wish people knew about you? And essentially, the point of this activity is to get you thinking about how painful it is for us when we're misunderstood and people don't know us, and why it's so important for us to develop curiosity about other people and understand and build those connections with other people so that we can move together towards creating change. So the second reason why storytelling is important is it helps us to build those connections. When we know someone else's story, when we're able to have an emotional connection and be able to see ourselves in someone else, then we're much more likely to act in their favor. Okay, number 3, stories help us to make meaning. So this is some researchers from John and Harrington who found that self-awareness is the most important quality for effective leadership. So this part of storytelling really is about us learning about ourselves as a practice of self-reflection. When we acknowledge our own mistakes with mindfulness and self-compassion, we're actually able to move through our challenges with more ease. And researcher Diane Cattell found that when educators write stories about their experiences, even if they fictionalize parts of them, they gain powerful insights about their leadership, and it makes them better leaders. So she did a lot of research that looked into, or had educators like a school principal write out a situation, literally tell the story of a situation that they lived through at their school, writing about it in third person. So describing maybe a fight on the yard or their approach to professional development. It doesn't really matter what it was, but had them write the story out. And in the act of writing that story, she found that educators gained deeper and more profound insights than they did if they just pondered on it without the act of writing and telling the story. So when we tell our own stories and learn about our own stories, it helps us to be more self-aware, and that also helps us to have deeper compassion and be more effective in our work. This is a quote from Diane Cattell based on her research. She says, storytelling can help leaders listen and interpret their own experiences as well as experiences of others. Stories assist a leader in making sense of their role by initiating reflection on actions and creating an opportunity for growth. Attending to the stories of your life cannot be thought of as a passive exercise. Rather, the act of unearthing the stories of your life is absolutely essential to your leadership growth. So again, if we want to grow as leaders, whether we're teachers or school leaders or higher up, when we attend to our own stories, when we're curious about our own stories, it helps us to be better leaders and helps us to grow more profoundly. So this is another activity, and we don't have a lot of time because we're almost running out of time already. But I invite you to do it later. So I'm going to talk you through it, and then you can go back and rewatch the video and do it later. But really quickly, write down the name of two events that you believe contributed to your leadership development. It could be your experiences with a mentor. It could be a great